When you look at Sega Saturn collecting today, there are three tiers of games. You have the top tier, the tier that has US versions of Panzer Dragoon Saga, Magic Knight Ray Earth, and Albert Odyssey, to name three super expensive games, and very good games. And then you have the mid-tier, the bread and butter, I think, of Saturn collecting. And this is where you have a lot of Japanese versions of expensive US games. Think about the Sega Ages games, or some of the Capcom fighters, a couple shooters in there like Dodonpachi or Layer Section. And I think those are the games that you can still obtain and really not be too upset when you look at your bank statement at the end of the month. And then you have the bottom tier games. And, the bottom tier doesn't mean that the games are bad. They're typically games that are from Japan that are very, very heavy in Japanese. Think Mahjong games, visual novels, things like that. But within that tier, there are some really enjoyable, highly playable games that I think would make a perfect addition to a Saturn collection that is just getting off the ground. The Saturn is one of the most rewarding retro consoles to collect for, and the prices of the actual hardware are not crazy. You can get a Saturn for about $100. And you're going to want an Action Replay Plus card, which you can get out there. This allows you to play import games and gives you all the expanded memory, expanded save slots, and things like that. So once you have this card, and once you have the hardware, I wanted to give you 5 games that you can pick up, and these games range right now on eBay from between $5 and $15, and I think they're the perfect starting point to your Sega Saturn collection. Alright, first up is Sakura Wars Hanagumi Taisen Columns. And what this is, it is columns. A sort of head-to-head battle columns with a story in the Sakura Wars universe. But at its heart, it is Columns, and I think Columns is kind of a classic Sega game, at least it is for me. It was the pack-in game with the Game Gear. I enjoyed the Genesis version. If you don't have the Japanese skills to read and understand the dialogue here, you won't necessarily enjoy the story mode, but the two-player battle mode is good, and then there's kind of classic endless columns play. So I think this is a solid game, and it's only $11 or $12 right now on eBay. Definitely worth adding to your collection. Next up is Blazing Tornado, and Blazing Tornado is basically Fire Pro Wrestling remade into an arcade game. So you have unrealistic comic book style wrestlers that are significantly larger than the sprite work that you would see in the traditional Fire Pro Wrestling games. But basically, the control system is there, the moves are a little bit more exaggerated, and when you hit a big one, there's kind of some super scaling that goes on with the sprites. But it is, at its heart, Fire Pro Wrestling, and that is a good thing. It's not terribly deep. It has kind of a tournament mode, a basic arcade mode. But it's fun, and it's only between $3 and $8 right now on eBay. So I think for that price, if you're getting into Sega Saturn collecting, it's a no-brainer. However, I will say you can sometimes find the regular Fire Pro game, 6-Man Scramble, for $10 to $15, and that is really the one to go for. But if you can't, at $5, this is a terrific game, and it's well worth picking up. Sega Saturn is known for being a system with a lot of great fighters, and I have to say, on the top of the heap for me, for 3D fighters, is Virtua Fighter 2. Now, Virtua Fighter 2 is reasonably priced because it was ubiquitous for the Sega Saturn, both in Japan and in the United States. The game can be had for around the $10 mark on eBay right now for the Japanese version. And to me, this is really one of the best games on the Saturn. Some may say the best on the Saturn. It was really well programmed at a time when it was hard to program for the system. It's fluid, it's fun, it's not quite the arcade game, but it doesn't need to be. I've put in many, many hours with this game. I return to it pretty much every year. It takes me back to when I first discovered Virtua Fighter 2. and if you can only have one 3D fighting game, this is the one to go for. It really is terrific. Let's move from 3D fighters to 2D fighters, and a lot of the 2D fighters on the Saturn, the really great ones, are in that mid-tier. They're $40, $50, $60 games, sometimes more, and obviously if you're getting the US versions, a lot more. So I went with Vampire Hunter. It is the Darkstalkers, I think the first Darkstalkers game that came out here in the US, and it's very cheap. I picked it up for around $11 to $12 a number of years ago, and it's still right at that mark. Sometimes you can even get it sub $10. I don't know why it's that cheap when all the other Capcom games are significantly more expensive, but it will start your Capcom fighter collection. One of the reasons I wanted to pick up a Saturn was to collect the Capcom 2D fighters. In fact, I just completed that collection recently. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the Darkstalkers series, but this game has all the attributes of a great Capcom fighter on the system. The anime-style graphics, the catchy sound, and the very tight controls. At under $15, you really need to pick this one up to start your fighter collection on the Saturn. And lastly, I decided to go with a driving game, and that is Sega Rally Championship. This is, I think, one of the best driving games on the system. There were a lot of 3D driving games. I think the one that certainly I remember and that I think resonates with a lot of people is Daytona USA. But it resonates for the reason that it wasn't necessarily the game that we had hoped it would be. Back in the day, it had a very choppy frame rate, a lot of draw-in, it felt slow and sluggish, and Sega Rally Championship corrects all of those issues. Yes, of course, the visuals do not hold up today, but it's faster. I thought it was more engaging as far as the drive than Daytona USA, and I think it is a classic Sega franchise. It's incredibly cheap. You can find it for, again, in that $8 to $10 range, sometimes as low as $5 or $6. I happened to get the US version when it was a little bit cheaper. You may still find the US version for under $20, but go with the Japanese version. You can even, I believe with the Japanese version, you can play with the Saturn analog stick, analog controller, which if you have one, that is an option, although that's become a little bit pricier these days. I was thinking you could also go with Manx TT. Manx TT is also a very technically accomplished racer on the Saturn, but it has 2 tracks as opposed to 3 tracks here, and it's not always in the sub $15 range. So I think Sega Rally Championship is cheap, it's good, and it's definitely worth picking up. So there you have it, 5 games that are incredibly cheap, that are fun, and that are really worth picking up to start your Sega Saturn collection. As I've said, collecting for the Sega Saturn is really one of the most rewarding pursuits in retro gaming, and the hardware is still obtainable. It's still, $150, and you've got the Saturn, you've got the Action Replay Plus card, and then really for the price of one new game, you can get these 5 games and be well on your way to enjoying the Sega Saturn.